Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Should fascists have free speech? Or are their ideas so threatening and dangerous, especially to minority races and faiths, that it's justified to deny them freedom of expression? The issue is in the news because the Oxford Union is staging a free speech debate, and it's invited as guest speakers the leader of the far-right British National Party, Nick Griffin, and the Holocaust revisionist historian David Irving. To some people, these men are fascists or fascist sympathisers. They are so dangerous that they should not be given public platforms. With me to discuss the issue are Luke Tryl, President of the Oxford Union, and Brendan O'Neill of Spiked. He's the editor of Spiked. Thank you both very much. Luke, why did you invite Nick Griffin and David Irving to this debate?
Well, the Oxford Union was founded 184 years ago to kind of discuss, debate and, above all, protect freedom of speech. It was set up at a time when university authorities were clamping down on freedom of speech, and I thought that this is an issue which is particularly relevant. I mean, lots of what the government's tried to do over the past sort of couple of years has kind of been narrowing freedom of speech, and I wanted to kind of go back to that original purpose and have a debate which looked at kind of free speech, how far is too far. And I think that these two people have awful and abhorrent views, but equally I think that the best thing to do is to kind of take them on in debate, to crush them in debate, and to win in debate. And so this forum was to kind of achieve that dual purpose of kind of exposing these people and crushing them in debate, and also going back to that kind of founding commitment of free speech and back to what we were founded for.
But of course some people, like your opponents in Unite Against Fascism, say, well, fair enough, have this debate, but don't give these people a platform. Have other people who can argue the case. Like Brendan.
Okay, but the point is, I don't think, David Irving, his views have been proved to be entirely wrong. He's been totally discredited. But this was a man who was kind of imprisoned for saying what he believed. I don't think you're going to find a more ideal person to kind of argue the case for freedom of speech. And the important thing is, as well, is that these are two people who are very much kind of at the limits of freedom of speech. And I think you need that there. You can't have a debate about extremism without extremists there themselves, I don't think.
Mm. I mean, Brendan, a lot of people would say, well, fair enough, freedom of speech is an important issue and principle to defend, but, in this particular case, these people have ideas which impact on wider communities and individuals. For many black and Muslim people, they find their ideas quite threatening, quite intimidating. Is therefore free speech justified in those circumstances?
I think you either have free speech for everyone or there's no such thing as free speech. I mean, there should be no limits whatsoever. And I think when you start talking about limits or how far can it go or is this too far, then effectively you don't have free speech, you have privileged speech or you have sectional speech. It's no longer freedom of speech. So I think if we're serious about free speech, then it has to be for absolutely everyone, including Irving and Griffin and various other people with abhorrent views. What I think is interesting about the Oxford Union debate is the fact that these people are not talking about race or immigration or the things that they're kind of obsessed with. They're talking about freedom of speech. This is the thing that's most interesting. And I think that's a quite striking development, because what's happened effectively in recent decades, over the past 20 years or so, is that the left has pretty much abandoned free speech. The left now has given up on free speech. It says no platform for fascists. It says you can't say certain things about immigration. It says that, homophobic music lyrics should be banned in some instances. There has been a kind of wholesale abandonment of fundamental free speech by sections of the left. And I think what that has meant as a result is that the banner or the torch of free speech has been handed to the right, and particularly to the far right. So you have a rather tragic situation now where David Irving can present himself as a champion of free speech, when in fact he's a sympathiser with people who, as we know historically, have always been opposed to free speech.
Isn't that a good point? Isn't that an important point? These are people who would, some people fear, if given half a chance, actually deny us, rest of us, free speech. Why should we give free speech to those who would deny others free speech?
I think that is true. I think if they had their way, they would deny free speech. And I think that the British National Party is quite open about it. The British National Party is opposed to freedom. It's opposed to freedom of movement into and out of Britain. So that, in my book, means it's fundamentally opposed to freedom. It's not a freedom-loving party at any stretch of the imagination. But I think we shouldn't deny them free speech just because they would seek to deny it to us or to other people. I think that would be stooping to their level. I think what's important here is that they've become defenders of free speech by default. Not because they have any kind of, they're not imbued with any sense of liberty, they don't love freedom, they don't desire freedom. They've become martyrs, effectively. And it's not the free speech or the platform provided by the Oxford Union and others that makes them into these powerful figures. It's actually the censorship of them. The reason Irving is now parading around Britain and other parts of the world as this great warrior for free speech is because he was imprisoned in Austria for a number of months, and he's been transformed into a free speech martyr. So I think, in fact, it's people like Unite Against Fascism and others who constantly say they mustn't have a platform, they must be banned, actually gives them more authority and hands them this free speech banner. That's the thing we should be worried about. People who consider themselves progressive and left-wing should reclaim the banner of free speech rather than seeking to deny it further.
Yeah. I should explain to viewers that we did invite Unite Against Fascism, which is very much opposed to Irving and Griffin being part of this debate, to join us here today. They said they were coming, but they haven't turned up. So, we gave them an opportunity. We wanted them to hear their point of view, but sadly, for whatever reason, they're not here. Luke, wouldn't it be right to say, though, that while it may not be right to ban these people outright, there isn't actually an obligation on prestigious institutions like the Oxford Union or the BBC or the Guardian to give them a platform? Isn't there a distinction between banning them, which I would strenuously oppose, unless they're committing criminal acts, and actually offering them a platform?
Yeah, but I don't know. I think in a lot of ways that's kind of a false distinction that's being made, because I think if there were certain people that you wouldn't invite to speak at a debating society which was set up on the principle of free speech, then the censorship is there. It's a latent censorship, but it is there and it's in the open. And again, having these people here I do think is important. And the point that you raised about kind of free speech and the fact that they'd restrict free speech is important as well. And that's one of the issues that I kind of want to come up in the debate and come up in the forum, is to look at how can they claim to defend free speech whilst they would restrict the free speech of others. And that's the purpose of the forum, is to kind of generate discussion, to bring out these ideas and things, and obviously to point out kind of the flaws in their arguments and stuff. And that's why they were invited for that purpose. So, but I do think the distinction between giving them a platform and banning them is actually a false distinction.
They're perfectly free to organise their own public meeting, produce their own video, run off leaflets and so on. I don't think anybody here, at least, is saying they shouldn't have that right in a free and open society. But the point is, do you actually have to give them a platform? Do you have to give a platform to people who advocate child sex abuse or genocide, or where do you draw the line?
Well, I think it's an issue of if someone has something useful to contribute to a particular debate, which these two clearly do. They are two people that are kind of the exemplars of the limit that have something to contribute. Then I think you kind of almost have an obligation to invite them to kind of participate in it. And I think particularly as an organisation which works for free speech, we have an obligation to have these people there.
Okay, Brendan. You said that there shouldn't be any limits on free speech, but surely, it's right to have laws against libel, for example, to stop me slandering you or someone else falsely as a paedophile, which might put your life at risk and result in your home being burnt down.
Well, I think I'm against the libel laws. I think they should be abolished, and that's partly because I've had bad experience. I worked for a magazine called Live in Marxism that was on the receiving end of libel, so I know what it's like. But it's also, the other reason I'm against them is because I think these things are best resolved in the public forum, in an open debate, rather than decided over by judges or experts or people who know better. And obviously the libel laws in this country are a disgrace. It's very difficult. If you're sued, it's very difficult to win. Libel very much goes against natural justice, turns the burden of proof on its head, and all these other various things. So there are great problems with the libel laws.
But wouldn't the innocent people who've been falsely labelled as paedophiles and been burnt out of their homes, and in some cases murdered, wouldn't they say that having robust laws against libel and strong, powerful protections against false accusations I mean, that's an issue of life and death.
I think if someone is burnt out of their home or murdered, then the people who are responsible are the people who did the burning and the murdering. And I think if we get to a situation where we say words ought to be censored or restricted in order to prevent house burnings and murder, then basically we're blurring the distinction between thoughts and actions. We're blurring the distinction between words and what happens as a result of those words. And if you do that, you're basically undermining the whole idea of free will, effectively, because you're saying that if someone says, you're a paedophile, go and burn his house, and people act on it, then it's the person who says that who should be punished. I think that gets things the wrong way around, and it kind of absolves people of responsibility for their violent
I wouldn't say
crimes.
that just the person who says it should be punished. I'd say that both the person who says it and the perpetrator should be punished.
Well, I think there's a broader issue here, which relates to incitement, because I'm very worried about the category of incitement at the moment, because it's been broadened more and more. In the past, incitement used to mean a close relationship between two or more people where they kind of connived and concocted a conspiracy and then decided to act on it and really cajoled people to do something and put pressure on them. Now incitement has become much broader, much flabbier. And you can now be incited, apparently, by hearing music over the radio, or you can be incited by seeing David Irving on TV. And I think that watering down of the meaning of incitement is a real problem, because it's now being used to censor all sorts of speech and things that we don't like on the nonsense grounds, I would argue, that words inflame people to act irrationally. I don't think that's true. I think we should trust people to be able to deal with offensive ideas. The vast majority of people will know that they're offensive, know that they're wrong, and just leave them to one side. So,
but isn't that the point? The vast majority of people will do that.
Yes.
But there'll be a small, disordered minority who perhaps will act upon them. So I would say, Luke, that in fact ideas can lead to actions. If ideas had no relationship to action, why would billions and billions be spent on advertising, which is about inducing people to do things, persuading people they need to buy things, and so on?
No, of course, but I think when we start kind of not having debates, not having discussion, because we're worried about violence, I think that's such a kind of dangerous form of censorship which has kind of crept into kind of British life. Like, people have said, are you not worried about kind of the risk of violence escalating because of this debate? And I say, like, the risk of violence is precisely kind of the reason we should have these debates, to kind of combat that, because when we start letting violence and intimidation stop us from having free debate, that's when I think kind of fascism has won.
But you're saying this from a position of relative privilege. I don't mean this offensively, but I can think of in years past some of my black and Muslim neighbours who were being terrorised by the likes of friends and supporters of Nick Griffin and the BNP, and before that the National Front. They said all this defence of free speech is fine in theory, but in practice, the adverse consequences for our lives, where we don't feel safe, where we feel threatened and intimidated, that's the reality. So what do you say?
Well, no, I agree that it is the reality, but I think that's precisely the reason that kind of having this debate at the Union is acceptable, because it doesn't affect that reality. These, like the BNP, are a political force, like the National Front are a kind of force of thugs which are present in our society, and I don't think we can kind of pretend that they don't exist or kind of try and sweep them on the carpet. And I honestly do believe that the only way that we're going to kind of defeat fascism, which is what Unite Against Fascism wants to do, is to actually take them on in open debate rather than kind of pretending that they don't exist. I mean, I'm from Halifax, and the times when the BNP seem to do well and kind of gain support is when they kind of portray themselves as being gagged, is when they say, look, I mean, remember there was a debate just before the last parliamentary election. I think the other parliamentary candidates wouldn't take on the BNP, and the BNP put out leaflets about it saying, look, the liberal mainstream are afraid to kind of take us on. And I think that's how the BNP gains support.
Okay. Who have you got against Nick Griffin and David Irving in this debate?
Well, I mean, because it's a kind of forum about free speech, we've got Anne Atkins is speaking, she's taking more kind of middle road kind of view on it. We've got James Dray, who's kind of doing it. He's from South Africa, and he's a DPhil student at Mansfield College. And then we're kind of.
But you haven't got any equivalent big hitters.
But the problem with getting kind of other equivalent big hitters is that so many of the big hitters have no platform with these people. Like, we've kind of invited lots of people to take part and participate, but all of them say we're not willing to share a platform with these people, which is kind of ridiculous, because you kind of think that they would be willing to kind of take these people on. If you disagree with them so much, then please do come and challenge them in debate and stuff.
Brendan, I mean, going back to your point about the distinction between words and actions, and the whole issue of what I would see a distinction between incitement to hatred and incitement to violence. You seem to be saying that even incitement to violence shouldn't be a crime.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between different types of incitement to violence. I mean, firstly, just coming back to your point about the small minority who may act on words, which I think is an interesting point because lots of people raise that. I think there may be an element of truth in that. There may be a very small minority who hear David Irving or the BNP or someone else and decide to go out and do some violent action. But, you know, you can't organise society around the basis of what a small, as you said, disordered minority would do, because effectively we'd all end up living in a lunatic asylum where the rules were enforced for the benefit of a disordered minority, which would be disastrous. But on the incitement to violence, I think we have to... I agree with you that words have consequences. Otherwise, why bother being a journalist? Why bother being an activist? You know, you want your words to have an impact. Sometimes you even want your words to make people act. You know, I've been on numerous demonstrations throughout the 1990s where speeches and words were designed to get people to storm a building or to do something against the law. You know, that's what words are designed for in certain situations. But I think we have to trust that people don't act irrationally when they hear words or when they read words. And I think as long as it's not a kind of close relationship where you're saying to someone, here's a knife, I want you to go over there and stab that guy because he's a real horrible person, that I would consider to be incitement. That I would consider to be a problematic use of words, where it's a direct possible danger that something physical will happen as a result. That's also the only instance where the American Civil Liberties Union, which the Americans have always been far better on free speech than the British left has been, that's the only instance they too support a restriction on people's use of words. But in other instances...
Can I pick up on that? I mean, I have some sympathy, but again, I would say that there are nuances in actual real-life situations. If a Jewish person, let's say, for example, is surrounded by a baying fascist mob, and someone starts screaming out, you know, Jews are filthy pigs, you know, Jews are taking our money, all this other anti-Semitic nonsense. In that context of a baying mob, aren't those words, you know, likely to encourage perhaps some people in that crowd to take it a step further? And for the sake of protecting people in that kind of vulnerable situation, don't we have to say that, perhaps not those words, but slightly more exaggerated words, need to actually be criminalised?
Well, it's a very dangerous territory that we're getting into here, because firstly, I think there's a danger in these discussions to depict free speech as being somehow problematic for ethnic minorities. So you will often hear United Against Fascism, I think you're kind of hinting at it here, saying that free speech is all well and good for nice middle-class students, no offence, and for journalists and all that, but it's not good for people on the rough end, urban black communities and isolated Jewish communities. I think there's a real danger in this discussion of free speech as being a threat or a danger to ethnic minorities, because it's in their interest, actually, to have as much freedom as possible and as much free speech as possible. And in the past, the left and ethnic minority groups would fight together to have freedom of speech and to have freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, because they recognised there was a common interest. So I think we should avoid discussing free speech as being dangerous for these individuals. Well, in that instance that you've mentioned, I think it would be very difficult to have a law that would in any way be useful in that situation. That's the problem. I mean, how would a law against incitement be useful when you've got a baying mob who are acting violently?
We already sort of have a law, the Public Order Act, behaviour likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress, including words likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. That is already a criminal offence.
But what that means, legalistically, what that means is that if there was a mob on the other side who were trying to defend the Jew from being beaten up, and a mob that you or I might be involved in, for example, we would also be criminalised if we said, kick the fascist's head in. Let's go after them. So I think that's the danger when you get into the situation where you criminalise words, because obviously in the situation you raise of a Jew kind of being threatened by a baying mob, the best solution is for there to be an alternative force who can help him and rescue him. That's the only solution, I think. I don't think the law would be very beneficial for that individual, whereas other people acting and speaking and defending him. So again, it's more freedom, more liberty, more openness, where I think the problem with laws against speech is that they are instituted on the basis of tackling the BNP and fascists and people who criticise Muslims, for example, but then they are used across the board against all sorts of people, and we all suffer as a result.
I mean, Luke, can I just give you an example of something from my own past? In the 1970s, I was involved in the big campaigns against the National Front. And, we did have a policy of no platform for the National Front, and we disrupted their meetings, stopped them holding meetings, disrupted their marches. Now, some people would argue that that campaign of no platform for the National Front actually helped stem their political rise, that they would have become much more influential and powerful if they'd had a free opportunity to hold public meetings, to march where they wanted to, and so on. So isn't that a justification for saying that in practical terms, it's a regrettable compromise on the principle of free speech, but for the sake of defending, particularly in those cases, ethnic minority communities, it was a justified abrogation of the free speech principle for a greater good?
Well, I disagree, and I think that kind of fails on kind of two levels. I think the first level is I think it sets quite a dangerous precedent to say that we should kind of stem the free speech of, however abhorrently our political parties, for the greater good. And if you look at kind of some of the comparisons of that throughout history, they do set quite a worrying precedent. But secondly, I just don't think that kind of in the present climate that kind of thing works. I mean, United Against Fascism has a kind of no platform with the BNP at the moment. Lots of organisations do, and yet the BNP has, 50 councillors. Their share of the vote over the past year in local by-elections has been going up. Obviously, it seems now that this kind of no platform thing just isn't working. It just isn't the way to take them on and win. And I honestly think that unless the mainstream starts making an effort to kind of take them on, to prove why they're so wrong, that we're going to see their levels of support continue to rise. Because people are very taken in by kind of the argument that the liberal mainstream is afraid to debate with us. Why won't they listen to what we've got to say? It's because what we've got to say is right. And I think it's time for kind of our kind of sensible side of the argument to come to take them on, to prove that they're wrong. And hopefully, I think that will have a much greater force in stemming their kind of political rise.
Go on.
I think that's true, and it's simply the case that laws against certain kinds of speech just don't work, except usually to the benefit of the person being censored. So if you look at Germany and Austria, for example, they have very tough laws against Holocaust denial, but they have a far greater number of active Holocaust deniers than you do here in Britain. I mean, they have many more David Irvings. He's a hero to certain groups over there. So those laws just aren't working, and in fact they have the opposite consequence, because if you suppress an idea and say it's too awful, we can't possibly discuss it, you effectively turn into an exotic fruit, an exotic idea that people are drawn to, especially people who want to kick against the real any sense of conformity or any sense of authority. They latch onto the thing that seems most controversial and the most shocking thing you could do. So actually it has the reverse effect and attracts people to Holocaust denial as this kind of sexy idea.
But I would say
if you were to openly discuss these things and have a one-to-one with Irving or anyone else, for example, like Deborah Lipstadt did in a court case in 2000, and his ideas just collapsed before the world's eyes as a load of nonsense, and there was no question about it. Unfortunately, it happened in the libel courts because Irving used the libel laws. I mean, this is the guy who now claims to be for free speech. He wanted Lipstadt to pulp her book. But the benefit of that court case is that she fought back and his ideas were demolished. And that's the way I think we should approach these things.
What about another scenario? Some people might say that if there had been a no platform for the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s, perhaps its rise may have been stemmed. Perhaps Hitler would have never come to power. Perhaps the Holocaust would have never happened. Perhaps there would have been no Second World War. I mean, I know it's all a lot of ifs and might-be's and so on, but, it is sort of a compelling argument when you think, that if the Nazis didn't have the platform, if they didn't have the opportunity to promote their propaganda, then perhaps all these terrible things wouldn't have happened. Isn't that a compelling argument to say that yes, we should defend this principle in 99.9% of cases, but there may be some exceptional cases where it's justified in abrogating it?
Well, I think firstly you can't compare the Nazi Party to the BNP. I mean, one important thing I would say about the BNP is that I think they are a bunch of losers. I mean, they are not as influential or as big as people like United Against Fascism claim. I mean, they are a fairly insignificant party. They have loads of weird ideas. I mean, they're environmentalists as well as being against immigration. They're not the Nazi Party by any stretch of the imagination. But the problem, I think, with what you're saying is that the problem under the Nazis wasn't that, by any stretch of the imagination, was not that there was too much free speech and that the Nazis had too much of a platform and too much freedom to put their views across. The problem was that there wasn't enough. And it was the Nazis who were responsible for that, who burnt books and who said that certain parties were not allowed and trade unions were not allowed and Jews were not allowed to speak or to, have conversations with certain other groups.
In the period before they came to power, if they'd been denied a platform before they came to power, then perhaps they never would have come to power.
Well, the question is, who would have denied them a platform? I mean, how would that have worked? I mean, the Nazis burst through and became what they became as a result of various historical and political factors following the First World War right through to the Second World War. I don't see how you could have, there could be, there was no possibility of a kind of Islington-type community group who is saying no platform to Hitler. I mean, I just don't think that is realistic at any level. And, their use of violence and force and censorship was the real problem there.
And kind of, if you look at the example of England at the time when you had kind of Oswald Mosley's kind of British fascist force, they were kind of quite soundly defeated quite easily, and there was no platform against them, even when you had newspapers kind of openly supporting like Mosley's fascists and stuff, and yet they were beaten. I think what you had in Germany was kind of an economic situation which kind of tended towards extremism, and I think what would have happened had there been kind of restrictions of the type that you're suggesting, that the Nazi Party would have just taken power by kind of violent means. I mean, there'd already been kind of rebellions and revolutions in Germany. I think it was only a matter of time, given the kind of economic climate, that something like that would have happened.
Okay, just to bring it back to Britain and here and now, I mean, if we're saying that free speech is sacrosanct, does that mean that the laws against inciting racial hatred should be repealed?
I perhaps take a slightly more restrictive view than you on this. I think there is kind of a case for having laws to kind of stop racial hatred.
Well, if racial hatred, what about homophobic hatred or hatred against travellers or asylum seekers?
But the problem is then kind of where do you draw the line, I guess? Where does it come in, and what kind of statements do you kind of stop? And these things can kind of end up spiralling out of control and things. And as we saw with the proposed religious hatred laws, which were debated through Parliament, they'd have had kind of profound consequences, not just against people who are kind of abusing people, but also kind of against people using religious jokes kind of in comedy, in the arts and things like that. And I think then you've got to kind of take a step back and say, kind of, where does the greater good lie?
What's your view on this? Should the laws against racial hatred be repealed?
Well, I think there is a very... race is not a category that I fond of, and not something that I kind of recognise as being legitimate. But there is a difference between someone's race and someone's religion, fundamentally, which is that, as people often point out, there's nothing you can do about where you come from and what you look like, but your religion is a choice, and therefore it should be subject to ridicule and debate and everything else. But the problem is that by saying that the authorities should have the right to restrict what we say about race and how we judge people and everything else, it avoids the fact that it's the state itself that is responsible for racism fundamentally. And when Unite Against Fascism and others call on the authorities or the state and the government and various others to clamp down on the BNP, they're effectively giving the state the right to determine who says what and letting them off the hook for their own role in sustaining racist attitudes.
Okay. We'll need to finish there, but thank you both for joining this debate about free speech, what limits should exist, if any, and how do we best defend vulnerable communities against those who promote hatred and violence. And please join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.